Welcome to today's BSI webinar entitled Certification and Resilience in Aerospace MROs. In an effort to minimize background noise, we have muted all phone lines. As always, we encourage questions and comments throughout the presentation using the chat box located on the left-hand side of your screen. This applies to any technical assistance you may need, as well as submitting questions which will be answered at the end if time permits. All of today's participants will receive a link to enroll for a recording of today's webinar. Lastly, we ask you to participate in a brief survey following the web conference. We appreciate feedback and suggestions to improve our future conferences. Before I turn it over to our presenter, allow me a few moments of introduction. Today's webinar will be led by Brendan Hill. Brendan is our BSI's Global Product Champion for Aerospace. Brendan has been in the aviation and engineering field for 40 years, including 26 years as a British Army officer and aircraft engineer. He served in many theaters of operation as well as in quality management roles. He has been in business assurance and certification for 10 years, before with BSI, where he has developed BSI services for aerospace. He has also worked in the industry as a group quality manager for 3 factories, 2 CNC manufacturing, which supply aerospace as well as other sectors. So I'll turn it over to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome everybody to this BSI webinar. We're going to talk about certification, the benefits of certification, particularly in MRO, maintenance, repair and overhaul, and we're going to talk about resilience in industry as well. So without further ado, let's start progressing. Let's look at the agenda. A very brief introduction to BSI for any that aren't aware of BSI's portfolio, and then look at why have certified management systems, so supplementing the regulatory side of things, and then going beyond quality into organizational resilience. So BSI is a Royal Charter company. We've been around since 1991, so we've got a long history, and we were the world's first national standards body and a founding member of ISO. And we've been instrumental in developing over 37,000 standards, including 10 of the top 12 business standards used globally. Those of which, many of those you'll be familiar with: 14,001, 45,001, 9,001, and so on. So we're at the heart of industry and helping industry be assured that it's doing the right thing and meeting all its contractual requirements, meeting customer needs and stakeholder needs. We're a truly global brand with 3 hubs around the world, and we operate in 193 countries with over 86,000 clients. So wherever you are, wherever you operate, we have the means to support you. And we've been an innovator, and as we said, we wrote many of the key standards. Quality management, information security, very pertinent to every aerospace company, in fact every industry now. Not a day goes by without somebody notifying that they've been hacked or had their systems in some way disturbed. So 27,000 is particularly important. Business continuity, which works well with the resilience side of things. BS 65,000, which we'll talk about briefly towards the end. And our key streams: standards, writing of standards, and there are thousands of standards out there. Any materials and systems that you use somewhere along the line, BSI will no doubt be involved in them. And we provide certification, third-party certification, and we're recognized as one of the world's best certification bodies. In fact, in my opinion, we're one of the best in aerospace. We've worked very hard to focus on the aerospace sector. We have an independent part of BSI which does consultancy, and we have the product testing, which gives an organization the universally recognized kite mark, been around since 1903. So that's our provenance, and of course support all those. We can provide training, and we do training in aerospace management as well as the specialist tools, APQP, MSA, Lean, and so on. And we've got a wide variety of customers. Many of those you'll be familiar with. So let's move on to the meat of today. Why have certified management systems? Why have standards? Well, if we go back through history, all technology and all systems were once new. So John Barry Wolfe formed us in 1901. He designed Tower Bridge in London, and the first standard was a specification for rolled steel. And specifications were critical because without them, materials, dimensions, and the way of doing things, the way of overhauling and maintaining things, were too diverse. And the consequence of diversity was that sometimes things went awry. Now, that's a train. If that happens on the ground, there may be some collateral damage to the side, but it's nothing like the potential that arises from an aircraft incident. And sadly, we've all been reminded of that over the last 6 months with the two 737 MAX issues. So the importance of standards in every aspect of aircraft design, certification, maintenance, repair and overhaul is readily evident. So why have a QMS? In a simple word, quality, right first time and on time. The 9100 standards are all written around two things: 100% on-time delivery and 100% conformity. So whether that's manufacturing or whether it's maintenance, repair and overhaul, those are the two things that every stakeholder wants. But we're also looking at safety, safe service delivery and safe operations. And again, those recent incidents highlight the importance of MROs. And I think it's often overlooked what we're trying to do in MROs. Flight safety, that's what we're trying to do. Each is a business, each organization needs to be financially viable, it needs to be able to meet its stakeholder needs, it needs to meet the needs of its investors, it needs to meet turnaround times, it needs to get aircraft out on the line on time. But we mustn't overlook flight safety, and that's really critical. And standards can really help in every aspect of the maintenance, repair and overhaul management. You need to meet those customer expectations, you need to be cost effective and assure all stakeholders. So there's nothing new there. And some might argue that that's what Part 145 or the FAA repair station regulation does. But I'm going to talk a little later more about the deltas, the differences between regulation and an assured business. Going beyond quality, we need to look at resilience. An organization needs to be profitable, sustainable. It needs to be able to anticipate, prepare for, respond and adapt to both incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. And we can all think of organizations which have failed to do that. You don't want to be one of those. So we're going to talk about resilience towards the end of this presentation as well. Corporate reputation. Again, going back to the most recent and sad incidents, corporate reputations are easily damaged. You need to protect every element of that reputation. And there are various standards that are pertinent. Environment, health and safety. Think about your employers and stakeholders, product safety, bribery and corruption, being a good partner for business, data and security, and all the contractual agreements you have. Somewhere in there will be something about protecting the intellectual property of your clients. So you've got to think in the round when looking at going beyond quality, and that's what resilience is about. So let's think about standards then. The 9110 standard, which is the maintenance and overhaul standard, says that the potential benefits of an organization implementing a quality management system are the ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable regulatory requirements. So it helps in meeting regulatory requirements consistently. It facilitates opportunities to enhance customer satisfaction. Everyone out there is meeting the customer needs, whether it's an aircraft operator or an aircraft repair organization. They each have very specific needs. You've got to address risks and opportunities, and it's interesting that the Part 145 regulation mentions the word risk once, whereas the 9110 standard uses the word risk 79 times. So that is quite a significant difference in the approach between a regulatory organization and a 9110 certified organization. So it is rather more than just complying with regulations. It changes the mindset, it changes the culture, it changes the approach to meeting the needs of all those stakeholders. This is an extract from Part 145, which is the European regulatory standard and equates to an FAA repair station. The organisation shall establish procedures agreed by the competent authority. So you've got to have documented standards. Those standards have got to cover, those procedures have got to cover all aspects of the maintenance activity and minimise the risk of multiple errors. And that's the one mention of risk in the regulatory standard. Quite interesting, one mention of risk. So you've got to meet all those things. So the risks, we're talking about multiple errors. It's the incident pit, the cone of disaster, or call it what you will. Any incident you care to look at pretty much has a whole series of things which go wrong and lead to an accident or an incident. There's no one thing that can be said to be solely responsible for that cause. So there's always a series of things that led to that problem. So if we look at this, the 9110, it says you have to have independent, sorry, the 145s, you have to have independent audits to monitor compliance and ensure the adequacy of procedures. That's an internal first-party audit of your system. How effective is that? We look at the FAA repair station regulation. It's very similar. That too says you must establish and maintain a quality control system. An interesting choice of words there. Talking about quality control, not quality assurance. And that alone is a philosophical difference between a regulation and a QMS, a quality management system, which is focusing on assurance. So the approach and the culture and the mindset behind it are different. So in summary, those say you've got to have an effective QMS. The correct standard for maintenance, repair and overhaul is 9100, not 9110, not 9100. But you need to have confidence in your system. You need to make sure that you're getting the best from it. You need to focus on the specific requirements. And as a senior manager or accountable manager, so you certainly need to know that it really works for you, protects your organization, and really works for your customers. And protecting your regulatory approval is rather critical. This is a photograph I took at a EASA presentation in Washington in 2018. I apologize for the two heads. These were two people in the audience. But the point is that on this presentation, EASA made two particular points. Common findings, quality system not in place and not effective. So they're saying that organizations that are regulated either have an ineffective QMS or no QMS in place. And the result of that in 2015 and 2016 is that 20% of all the organizations they visited lost their EASA approval. That's a terrible statistic. 1/5 of the organizations they visited were deemed to be not worthy of that regulatory approval. And then in 2017, it was the same. So that's a consistent statistic that for 3 years, organizations being visited by the regulator were unable to demonstrate they could meet the regulatory requirements for an effective quality management system. So having a 9110 certificate, if nothing else, is going to help you protect your regulatory approval. Make sure you're not going to be one of those 20% by having a third-party independent body come in and go through your standard, go through your QMS, go through your exposition, go through your procedures, and then verify the effective implementation of everything you've written. That's going to protect your regulatory approval, which in turn means that it's protecting your stakeholders. Now, if we look at aerospace incidents, these graphs show that even though the number of yearly flights in millions is going up significantly, the overall number of hull loss, accidents and fatalities is going down. So it's a good trend. However, there are peaks and troughs. It's not a consistent trend downwards. So we want to avoid those peaks and troughs. Zero defects is where we need to be, right first time, every time. And of course, that's what a quality management system focuses on. It drives towards continuous improvement, that things can and do go wrong. And it's when a series of things go wrong that you find a problem. No one thing is going to cause an accident. It's a series of things which line up and lead to an incident. So in 2017, we had a record year. No passenger jet crashes and only 12 fatalities in total, depending on how you look at the data. So that's a really good thing. That was a positive year. And of course, ideally, we'd maintain that. Interestingly, relatively few MROs hold 9110 certification. So while manufacturing, the penetration of 9100 certification is very good, in MROs, the penetration of 9110 certification is relatively small. So it does make you wonder, is there a correlation between accidents and incidents? When I speak to MROs and I ask whether they have 9110 certification, they very often answer that they have 145, therefore don't need 9110. So if an organization has Part 21G, Part 21J and so on, but also has 9100, why is there a different mindset between the manufacturing organizations and the MROs? Now, talking about these recent incidents, and sad though they are, we can start drawing information from them already. The Lion Air in October last year is still being investigated. But these bullet points here are the quotes from the investigation. That's the sequence of issues. And the crew said that they couldn't determine the altitude of the aircraft because all the aircraft instruments were indicating different altitudes. Now, I'm a pilot myself, albeit only for small aircraft, but you're always told to trust your instruments. So if you've got instruments telling you different things, which do you believe? So what do you do in that situation? And the follow-up question is, was it a maintenance error? Was one of the things that led to that sequence of events a maintenance error? Was an unsafe aircraft released? It's one of the things that's being considered because that aircraft had issues on its previous flight and there was some rectification work done. So somebody had to release that aircraft to flight following that rectification. I'm not saying it's an issue because it's still under an investigation. But this question, was it one of the steps that led to the catastrophe? And this is what we have really, the series of effects. And this is what a QMS is aimed at doing, preventing things. It's an assurance. It looks at all the hazards. Remember the difference between the regulation mentioning risk once and the QMS standard mentioning risk 79 times. So you've got latent conditions, which a QMS should identify when you're doing your risk-based thinking, when you're setting out all your procedures, writing your manuals, writing your documentation. And then you've got the other holes due to active failures. So these could be behaviors, lack of mindfulness, lack of awareness, lack of competence. When all those things line up, that's when you can end up with an accident or an incident. So when things are going well, that's what we have in mind. Whenever we go flying, and I'm going flying tomorrow, that's what I have in mind. A nice, safe aircraft where everything's working, the crew are competent, the engineers that worked are competent, and as long as the in-flight entertainment's okay, happy days. But then we look at these when things go wrong. Now, every one of these incidents was due to a series of events. Somebody made decisions, made the wrong decisions, and released an aircraft to flight. In the case of Concorde, for example, it wasn't Concorde itself which had a problem, but it was the maintenance of the aircraft that took off before it. And the panel was left loose, and that came off on the airfield. That was one of the things that went wrong. And then normally before Concorde took off, there was a check of the runway to make sure there was no FOD, no loose articles. For some reason before that aircraft took off, they decided not to do that. So that's at least two things in the cone of failure, the incident pit, that led to that aircraft crashing and 100 souls perished. So it's never any one thing that leads to these incidents. So let's look at standards briefly. The IAQG, those of you listening I'm sure are familiar with the IAQG, but we have the three sectors, which is the Asia Pacific sector, the European sector, and the Americas sector. And they have the three standards, 9100, 9110, and 9120. We're, of course, focusing on the 9110 because that's the pertinent one for MROs. So why do we have third-party certification? Well, it's essential for some. It gives you independent, rigorous assurance. Remember, it's assurance, not control. So it's focusing on a different approach. It assures your clients and stakeholders, brings in the flight safety, and brings in the reputation, and assures your regulator. You don't want to be one of the 20% of the EASA withdraws the regulatory approval every year. Globally recognized, promoted by the primes. They wrote the standard. So the standards that we would be auditing you to are written by industry. It's not like ISO 9001, which was written by the Committee of General Industry Personnel. This is written specifically by the aerospace industry, so it's written to meet the precise requirements of you as an MRO. And it drives your business. Continuing improvement, culture, ownership, responsibility, a just culture, and the benefit of OASIS registration. So you're registered on a database, which means potentially it's a business winning option as well. So 9110 is written for MRO, addresses the particular requirements, risks and issues. 9100 is general and not specific. It's worth noting that in some areas 9100 is seen as being hierarchically superior to 9110. People seem to think that 9100 is the highest standard and 9110 is a lesser standard and 9120 lesser still. That's not the case. They are all of equal merit. You just pick the standard which is pertinent. So if you have 9100, then that's focusing on design, development, manufacture, not necessarily going to cover the specifics, the deltas in 9110. So you really should have the standard which is pertinent for you to focus on the quality and safety systems, the MRO processes, the things relevant to MRO, the people relevant to MRO, the accountable manager, the certifying staff. And it's also worth noting this part in the intended application. This is written into the 9110 standard. So the standard is intended for organizations that design, develop, or provide aviation, space, and defense products and services, and by organizations providing post-delivery activities, including maintenance of their own products. So 9100 is designed to apply to people doing MRO of their own products, not MRO of other people's products. So the 9110 specifics include things like facilities, human factors training, accountable manager, certifying staff, tools and equipment provision, maintenance manuals, and of course you may design and development, do design and development of maintenance regimes. So 8.3 may apply to that. Components and spares, control of counterfeits, provenance and documentation, fabrication of new parts, unserviceable parts and materials management, segregation and mutilation. So these are just a sample of things which are specifically written into 9110, but which you won't find in 9100. So an MRO can assure this and prevent that. It brings all these three things together, the regulations, the standards, and the compliance. Now, to highlight the difference between a regulatory approach and a quality assurance approach. I'm going to tell you a little war story which dates from 1987 in Soest in Germany when I was serving in the army, and there was a Lynx helicopter XZ204 which crashed. Now in those days the military worked purely to a regulation, military regulations which were equivalent to the civilian airworthiness regulations at the time, so the equivalent of Part 145 and so on. So when I first arrived in Germany in 1979, so I'm going back quite a while, 40 years, we had the Westland Scout helicopter, and within 3 months of me arriving in Germany, we got rid of the Scouts and we got the Lynx aircraft. I'd never been trained on Lynx, and I worked on Lynx for 2 years before I had the joy of doing the course for that aircraft. Now that would never happen in a quality assured organisation, but under the regulations it was allowed to happen. So what were the risks linked to that? Well, if we go to Soest, step forward to 1987, there was a Lynx which had been in the hangar undergoing maintenance. The aircraft went out. It was going on a test flight. So there were 2 crew in the front, the pilot and the co-pilot, and in the back were 3 passengers because they thought they'd use the test flight to take these 3 chaps to Gütersloh so they could fly home on leave. The aircraft was in the air for a total of 6 minutes. It got to about 1,000 feet, had very little height, very little speed, and he lost his tail rotor. So without a tail rotor on a helicopter, if you've got no height and no speed, you've got no hope. That aircraft is going down. It is entirely out of control because the aircraft spins, and that's exactly what happened. The 2 crew in the front died. The 3 in the back just about got out. So what happened? How can we compare this to the regulatory situation to a quality assured situation? The tail rotor gearbox on the Lynx has oil in it, and it had a magnetic probe which was sealed with 2 O-rings. For some reason somebody decided to cannibalize one of the O-rings. So he took the mag probe out of the gearbox, removed the O-ring, and put the mag probe back into the gearbox. Now the magnetic probe is at the bottom of the gearbox, and without the O-ring, all the oil leaks out. So the first mistake they made was cannibalizing an O-ring. You don't cannibalize consumables like O-rings. The second mistake was he didn't document it, so there was no record in the aircraft manual that the O-ring had been cannibalized. The oil leaked out. So a chap working in the hangar, a young air trooper as they're called, a private soldier in the Army Air Corps, saw the oil and, being mindful, cleaned it up. So he cleaned the back of the aircraft, he cleaned the hangar floor, made everything nice and smart. So he's being mindful, but was he competent? Because the question he didn't ask was, where did the oil come from? Why is there so much oil down the back of this tail and on the hangar floor? So that's 2 things. And we then had an aircraft with no oil in the gearbox. The aircraft was returned to service and ready to go, and it has a technical flight servicing. So an engineer does a flight servicing of the aircraft, and there's a set checklist to go through. It's quite complex. But he, too, was not trained on that aircraft. He'd just been posted into Soest and was not trained on the Lynx. So he followed the book. He followed the regulations. He checked everything that he's supposed to check. But on the tail rotor gearbox, on the sight glass, the oil stains the sight glass. So it looks full. So everybody that's trained on the aircraft and is familiar with the aircraft knew to nudge the aircraft so you could see the oil moving in the sight glass. You check the meniscus. He didn't know that. He wasn't trained on the aircraft, wasn't familiar with it. So he read the book, followed the regulations, and signed the aircraft serviceable. So the net result is that aircraft took off with no oil in the tail rotor gearbox. So, as I said, it got to about 1,000 feet, 5 or 6 minutes into the flight. Gearbox seized completely, no tail rotor, aircraft span in. So it shows that even though that was an organisation which had regulation, all the rules were there, it didn't have a quality management standard, it didn't have internal audits, it didn't have the focus on culture, mindfulness, awareness, proper approach to competence of people. So the engineer, who was a trained engineer, he did the links pre-flight inspection, but he wasn't familiar with the aircraft type. A quality management system, properly implemented, properly audited, properly independently checked, with all the additional things such as culture, mindfulness, awareness, competence, arguably would have prevented that. So for me, that illustrates very well the key differences between regulations and the quality assurance approach with an independent, verified, effectively implemented quality management system. Sad tale, but I hope it illustrates the point. And you can Google that, XZ204 crash in Zoast 1987. Okay, moving on to less maudlin things. Looking on to resilience now. So we've got a quality management system. So now we look to go beyond that. How resilient is my business? It's a new paradigm, a new way of thinking. So it supports all the things we've talked about, the difference between regulation and quality assurance, and takes us into how to make an organization resilient. BSI launched the BS 65000 standard, which is guidance. Notice not a certifiable standard. It's a guidance document on making your organization resilient, giving it the ability of an organization to anticipate, prepare for, respond and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. Every organization should be looking at that, even in aviation. Commercial aerospace is growing. It's an expanding market, but there are incremental changes and there are sudden changes. Not just in the market, there are other things which can impact on the resilience of an organization. Who would have thought that Bombardier in Northern Ireland would have been put up for sale last week? So even in an organization which is growing, it can suddenly decide to divest itself of an organization with 5,000 people. So resilience, we started looking at resilience really in 2000, developed it over 15 years, and then in 2014 launched the world's first standard for organizational resilience. And it works on three key domains: operational resilience, information resilience, and supply chain resilience. And you can readily map that, of course, to what we do in MRO. Operational resilience is governing your business, running the business, looking at your customer needs, managing and securing everything you do in that production side of the MRO. And then in supply chain, you need to look at things pertinent to aerospace, counterfeits, unapproved parts. So a part could be unapproved even though it is a genuine part, but it may have the wrong documentation if it hasn't got an 8130 or an EASA Form 1, even though it's a genuine part made by the original manufacturer. If it hasn't got the right supporting documentation from the right regulatory approval, it's still an unapproved part. So you're looking at your supply chain resilience. And then information resilience brings in data security, information security, 27001, for example. But there's a whole range of things that are pertinent. And using this structure, you can identify where you are now, where you need to be, where you're strong, where you're weak, and which actions you need to take to make sure you've identified all those risks. So it's about risk-based thinking, which of course 9100 series requires, and giving you a structure around which to apply it. And if we think about building an aircraft or maintaining an aircraft, you've got a huge supply chain or supply web really, which brings in different elements, different levels of material supply, product supply, counterfeit problems. But then there's all the other things you need to think about: origin and traceability, production methods, brand reputation, protection of your people, health and safety, corporate social responsibility, sustainability. All these things are pertinent to the ability of your organization to stay for the long haul. So if we look at information resilience as an example, things you would think about would be cybersecurity, security awareness. Phishing is the easiest way of getting into an organization. I think I probably get 2 or 3 phishing emails a week, but because I'm trained and aware, I send them to our IT help desk. That's the easiest way of getting into a system though. So people have to be aware. Data management and privacy, GDPR of course has been pertinent over the last year. Then compliance and testing. And we can provide services towards the Internet of Things and the Internet of Aircraft, which is an up-and-coming way of thinking. And any organization can log on to the BSA website and look at the organizational resilience benchmark, and you can benchmark yourself against industry. And we took 1,260 companies globally, of which 93 were aerospace. So by doing that exercise, you can get a good idea of where you are in terms of resilience against the global industry. This slide is taken from the IAQG conference in Busan last year. The IAQG itself, the International Aerospace Quality Group, has realized the benefits of organizational resilience and built it into its strategy. And this slide is from the briefing by the strategy working group of the IAQG. And as you can see, they're deploying an operating and resilience plan, accelerating the IAQG product to stakeholders. So in summary, we all have a part to play in the continuing and sustained improvement in safety. MROs should be certified to 9110 rather than the 9100 because you don't get the benefits of the focus on the maintenance, repair and overhaul aspects that you would get from a 9110. Have the right standard, implement and sustain the best practice, continually improve all aspects of performance and cost effectiveness and growth. And of course these things aren't looked at by the regulator. They are purely looking at compliance. A regulatory audit is virtually an old-fashioned checklist audit which has its place, but it's very different to a process-based audit as you would get from 9110 certification. And if you really want to go beyond quality, I would commend the Organizational Resilience Standard. Have a look at BSI's unique thought leadership and go beyond quality and be resilient. I hope that was informative. I hope it helps understand the differences between regulation and quality assurance through third-party certification. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them if you'd care to type them into the questions box. Otherwise, over to Anne.
Alrighty, thank you, Brendan. We also want to thank our audience for attending BSI's web conference. You can anticipate a follow-up email within the next week, which again will include a link to enroll in today's recording. Please complete the survey to provide feedback and ideas for future webinars. We do appreciate your input. Be sure to join us again and visit our website at bsiamerica.com/events to view upcoming webinars. Thank you all, and goodbye.